My name is Cecilia and I'm a member of the Lakes Region Conservation Corps here at the Squam Lakes Association, and today we're going to be talking about watercoloring. I have been casually watercoloring for about a year and a half now, with a lot more emphasis on it in the past couple months. It's been really fun having moved to a new place because I'm getting inspired to paint landscapes and scenes that I wouldn't have been able to see anywhere other than New Hampshire. I love watercoloring because I think that it gives my eye a little bit more nuance when I'm looking at landscapes. I am much more likely to notice color differences and differentiation in shadows because I'm thinking about how it is that I would paint a thing like that. Today I'm going to go over some tips for how to create convincing snow scenes, followed by a tutorial of how I created this snow scene in particular. One of the first difficulties I came across when I was trying to learn how to paint snowscapes was that it ended up looking very one-dimensional. There weren't very many colors, and I didn't really know how to create snow that was white. And so what I decided to do is to create a color chart of all the different colors that I could paint with the paint palette that I have. And that actually gave me a much better idea of what colors I do have the ability to make, and gave me a quick cheat sheet on. So that's my first tip, is creating a color chart to give you a little cheat sheet so that you know what you can paint. The next thing that I did is I watched a lot of YouTube tutorials, and a lot of these YouTube tutorials were very helpful in that they let me know that I didn't need for the snow to be white, I just needed it to be lighter than the other colors in the painting. And so I stopped leaving places completely blank and started doing a light wash of a very light color. That way I could create a lot of shadow and a little bit of nuance in the snow. And the thing about watercolor painting is that it's not that you're trying to create something one-to-one. You're not going to ever get a landscape that looks exactly like what you're looking at. However, our eyes are very good at kind of tricking ourselves into seeing what we've created for ourselves to see. Even after having created my color chart, I still wasn't so confident in making some of the most important colors in a snow scene gray and black. And so this was another thing that I ended up going to YouTube for, is trying to figure out how can I mix it, because I don't have that color in my palette. And the most helpful thing that I found is using a complementary color wheel in order to determine what colors you need to add to make a color block. So you start out with the primary colors of yellow, red, and blue, and you mix those together. Based on the color that it appears, you're going to add the color directly across the color that it is too much of on the color wheel. As you can see here, this color has ended up being a bit too yellow for my taste, a little bit yellow, a little bit orange, and so I'm going to add a little bit of blue because that is the complementary color to orange. And I'm kind of removing the paint on the edge of the paint tin so that I don't have to wash my my paintbrush as much, just because it's easier. So here we go. I added too much blue. Of course, that always happens. So let me do a little test of this color. It's a little bit green, and so in order to counteract that green blue, I'm going to add some red. It's a bit of a touch and go process where you can end up messing up your paint color that you're trying to create, but eventually you get to it, and it's just always a process. There's no direct formula that I ever use to create a color. I created a very pretty mahogany purplish red. Quite a process, and I think it's a bit more laborious just because I am not very experienced in color mixing. I'm still practicing and learning, so it's something that I think will definitely improve with time. This is the kind of color that I sometimes will just stop and use because I'm tired of mixing. But if we look at it, it's still a bit green, a little bit on the grayer side, which is nice. I'm gonna add just a little bit of red, see if I can finally get the color I'm looking for. Of course, the more water you add, the more watery the paint mixture is going to be. And so sometimes you can just kind of let it dry out and then rehydrate it a little bit later. Or you can try and mix more colors into it to try and get a deeper hue. All right, here we go. Let's try this color. There we go. That's that gray I'm looking for. I'm going to do a short tutorial on how I recreated this snow scene on a hike up Eagle Cliff Trail. I started off by sketching the outline of what I wanted to put down on paper because it's pretty easy for me to forget exactly what it is that I'm planning to do. And so I'm going to make decisions about what I'm going to include and what I'm going to leave out, as well as where I think that there's going to be darker areas and lighter areas. At this point, it's also good to think about what you want the focal point or the most distinct part of the painting to be. And for this painting, I decided that I was going to put a lot of focus on the trail as well as some of the trees in the foreground. Because I wanted the trees in the foreground to have some snow on them and I didn't want to have to paint around it, I taped some sections out using Scotch tape. I am starting with the sky in this painting because it seems to be the lightest color as well as the one furthest in the background. So first I put down a base of just water and then a little blue mixture that's very dilute. Again, it's very, very light because this is going to be the background and you can always get darker, but you can't get any lighter as you're painting. To add a little bit of texture to the background so I don't have to put in quite so many hand-drawn trees, I salted some of the wet surfaces and that creates a fun textural background. Dripping in a little bit of a greener brown. This is going to add some more texture to the background. The more nuance and color, the better a painting looks. Because I'm applying it to the salted surface, I'm just kind of dripping it in and it's allowing it to disperse really nicely. And the hope is that when it dries, it'll create an interesting branching texture. And if your painting is exclusively cool colors, which is tempting to do in a snow scene, then it actually becomes a lot more two-dimensional. And so I found that adding a little bit of red, adding a little bit of yellow actually lightens up that scene and makes it more interesting to look at. I went in and added some dark gray black to the base of the trees, and that's going to establish a shadow line and act as a good backdrop to contrast with the snow. Here I'm rubbing my paintbrush through the salt because it creates some interesting lines. It wasn't as successful this time as it has been for me in the past, but I do love just trying to add texture by using different techniques that sometimes work, sometimes don't. This is what it looks like after I rubbed all the salt off of it. You can see that there is some white spots that wouldn't have been there if I hadn't added that. My next step is to go in with a really dark black color and create the outlines of some of the trees. I'm not working on the trees in the foregrounds yet. Those are the ones with the tape snow, but I do still have the tape on there so that I can put some trees in the background. I also need to think about where the light source is coming from, and that's going to inform which side of the snow I paint the trees. One tip that I have for painting trees on is using really jerky motions. I found that if I try to curve too much or use too long and straight of lines, then the trees don't look as natural. So it's definitely a practice in patience of deciding when a tree is done and when it needs more work. And I have found that it's easier to add more later on than it is to go back and remove some. Now I'm going in with a slightly darker color to do the trees in the foreground. I do wish that I had done some of the details in the snow before I decided to go in with this really dark color. It's always smart to go from less detail to more detail. Here I'm using a brush with a flat edge, and I found that that's the most helpful for me in creating trees, but whatever works for you is great. Here I am going in with my second layer of the darker color. That's just going to make it a little bit less transparent. And I'm also going back in and adding some other details, increasing the shadows down below. As you can see, they got a little bit too piecey. And so I go back in with a little bit of a wet brush to try and even some of that out. Now I'm going in with a very, very tight brush stroke to try and create some of those branches that you can see down at the bottom. And this is going to help create some texture in the snow, as well as create the image of the snow piling on top of things. So this is a lot of looking at the painting and trying to figure out exactly where it would add, as opposed to looking at the photo reference. Finally, I'm going in and starting to create the shadow on the snow and starting to patch in that pathway. So I'm starting out with a very, very light color and using that to go in and do shadows on some of these trees. As you can see, it's hard for me to stay focused on one activity. Using mixtures of light and dark colors to create shadows. Even though it had originally been a pretty white surface that I was painting on, I went back in and added more blue to it in order to help with the contrast and the shadows. Here I'm using the shadows of the trees to kind of go over and under to create the image of the snow piling and pillowing. Adding darker and darker colors. Slowly but surely. At this point, I do consider my painting to be fairly done. I might go back in and add a couple more details, but at this point I've been looking at it for too long, so I'm pretty much done for today. All that needs to be done is to take the tape off and then flush out some of those lines so it's not so distinct between the black of the tree and the white of the snow. But I was pretty happy with this painting, and I thank you for joining me on this journey.